So how am I supposed to believe in the truth, the validity of Jesus in the Bible when we have no writings from Jesus himself? There's decades, if not up to 100-year period, where we have no writings from anybody else about Jesus when there were lesser supposed gods performing miracles, which they did write down. And then when you finally get to an account of Jesus, the Gospels, you have conflicting stories. Just quick example, when they go to the tomb and they roll the stone off, one, there's an earthquake and angels appear. The other one, that doesn't happen. One, there's Mary there. The other one, she's not. So they're not like small discrepancies like Jesus was wearing a red shirt or a blue shirt. We don't have any real evidence from Jesus during his lifetime. And then hundreds of years later, we're supposed to believe these conflicting reports. How am I supposed to reconcile that? Thank you.
Thanks for that. That's a shotgun of a lot of objections there. I don't want to necessarily discount any one of them by not being able to answer all of them. Obviously, with a time constraint, we have to make sure that we go to the more pungent ones you've actually mentioned. I think you're just factually wrong about the disparity between the times of the writings in Jesus' life. For example, when you look at actually the manuscript evidence, now we have what many scholars, one scholar in particular, probably one of the world's finest biblical manuscript scholars, says is an embarrassment of riches. In fact, most people, Gospel of John, good example, Gospel of John is the last gospel written. No one disputes that. Many thought it was written in the 200s AD, long after Jesus' death. And so there was all this presumption about how Gospel of John is theological, it's legendary embellishment, there's no possible way this could actually record the life of Jesus. Obviously, it's just someone's theological reflection after the church gets established. But then they find this little postage stamp-sized fragment of the Gospel of John, chapter 18. In fact, the very verses Ravi quoted when he talks to Pilate and he says, "Whoever's on the side of truth listens to me," is on this little fragment. The fragment itself is dated between 90 AD and 125 or 150 AD. That's the fragment. And it's a copy of a copy of a copy. Now, of course, as you know, copies come after originals. That's kind of how it works. So if the fragment of the Gospel of John, the very last gospel written, is a copy of a copy of a copy, and that's written between 90 and 125 or maybe 150 AD, that means the originals are even earlier than John. Now, if John is the last gospel written, and Luke and Matthew are written prior to him, then that means that they are written prior to 90 AD or so. They draw, in fact, Acts is a book that's a sequel to Luke. So if you follow the sequence backwards, you have John, not written in the 200s, easily written within the first century. Then you have Luke and Acts is the sequel to Luke. What's interesting about Luke is you look at what Gospel of Luke records. Amongst the manuscript evidence, there's great evidence for the early dating of Luke. But you look at what it records, and it actually follows, not the Gospel of Luke, sorry, the book of Acts, which Luke wrote. It records the life and times of essentially the apostles after Jesus' ascension. It focuses particularly on Paul. It talks about his shipwrecks, talks about his whippings, talks about his beatings, talks about his persecutions. You know what it leaves out? His death. Conspicuously absent is his death. We know when he died, AD 64. He was beheaded by the emperor. So what does that tell you about when Acts was written? If Luke left out the single most important event to culminate Paul's ministry, then we have to assume, at least it's reasonable to assume, that Luke was written before AD 64. Sorry, Acts was written before AD 64. If Acts was written before AD 64, and Acts is the sequel to Luke, that means Luke was probably written in the 50s. If Luke was written after Mark, that means Mark was written in the 50s or in the 40s. Jesus dies in 33. So it's definitely not hundreds of years later, not even close. We're finding earlier and earlier manuscripts. In fact, one scholar friend of mine said this about the accuracy of what the Bible actually records. He's a biblical scholar, a prestigious guy. He does a lot of writing, a lot of speaking. He says, you know what archaeologists do when they go to look in the ancient world, in the Middle East, to find out where thus and such or this thing is? The first book they look at is the Bible. Secular archaeologists look at it. So we have this, I think, an impressive corpus of material that's very early dated to the time of Jesus. And it's written, I think, by eyewitnesses. And there's great reasons to believe why either they are written by eyewitnesses or they contain the accounts of eyewitnesses. A great book you might be interested in reading, maybe you've already read it, but if you haven't, I would recommend it to your reading, is a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham. Richard Bauckham has forgotten more about ancient history than any of us will ever learn. And he talks about the eyewitness account. Mark's gospel is actually the transcription of Peter's testimony, his firsthand account of what I saw. Gospel of John is rife with eyewitness accounts. And you'll go through and you'll see all these things. So you see these eyewitness accounts that are written by the people who were actually there. And then one of the things that I think is amazing, I'm a trial lawyer, so evidence matters to me. I understand how evidence works. We have a thing called the hearsay rule. The hearsay rule says that out-of-court statements can't be admissible in court if they're being used to prove the truth of the matter asserted by the statement. That's a convoluted way to say we don't trust out-of-court statements that we can't cross-examine in court. There are a number of exceptions to the hearsay rule. Some say it's more whole than cheese, but the hearsay rule has exceptions. One of those exceptions is a statement against interest or an admission by an opponent. In other words, somebody who's on the other side of a case who says something that admits the weakness of his own case and the strength of yours. So you might say, well, all those eyewitness accounts were written by Christians. Well, it'd be weird if you saw the risen Christ and didn't become one. It'd be kind of strange. But what would you like to have as an eyewitness? You'd like to have an enemy of the Christian faith who thought it was wrong and was ready to stamp it out and suddenly become a Christian. That's exactly who Paul is. If I were in a trial and I had a witness like Paul, who was once my enemy but is now on my side of an issue, you put that guy on the stand and you let him sing his song to the jury over and over and over again because he's willing to change his mind, and it cost him something, and that gives him credibility. That's why we have exceptions of the hearsay rule for these kinds of things. Early dating of the Gospels, the reliability of the Gospels, as but one example. Even the Old Testament has a lot of these things as well. Then you have the credibility of the eyewitnesses themselves. Even hardened skeptics, Bart Ehrman, for example, will tell you this idea that we have no evidence for Jesus until hundreds and hundreds of years later, that is bunk. He went on the Atheist Guy radio show, and the Atheist Guy radio show host tried to say, well, we know that Jesus is just possibly a legend because there's not real evidence. And Bart Ehrman, who's not a Christian, who's an atheist, said, oh, that's not true. The guy says, well, you know what I mean. It's like, no, you can't be irresponsible like that. You have to point out there is strong evidence that Jesus existed and that he died by crucifixion for his claims to be the Messiah. And there's pretty good evidence for a resurrection, though I don't believe in it. So you see all that stuff. I say that's why I would say to trust him. There's great evidence, I think, for the historicity of the Gospels, and there's great evidence for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And they're all preserved in this little booklet that stood the test of time for 2,000 years. It's not like scholars haven't been poking at it. They've been poking at it for quite some time. But the presumptions of later dating have actually been sent to the flames by a little postage stamp as but one example of the manuscript evidence that's available for the Bible. So what I would say to you is, why should you trust it? I'd say because it's proven itself trustworthy. There's a healthy skepticism in your question, and I appreciate it. I think it's the right way to look at things. Why should I trust it? The question you have to ask yourself, and I have to ask myself, I'm not singling you out, I think everybody in this room has to ask. You can ask the question two ways. Why should I trust the Bible? Or, why should I trust the Bible? There's questions with the exact same wording, but I think different views on it. There's a skeptic who is somebody who believes something, who won't believe something until there's enough evidence. It's just natural. And then there's a cynic who doesn't believe even when there is. And I would suggest to you, take that skeptical view and look at the evidence, and I think it'll actually answer your question of why. Thank you so much for your question.